You know, when you stand in front of one of those massive, really intricate grandfather clocks, your eyes are immediately drawn to the big sweeping hands.
Yeah, the shiny parts.
Exactly. Look at the polished wood, the heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth. It's majestic to look at, but you almost certainly ignore the hundreds of microscopic, nearly invisible gears deep inside the casing that actually, well, keep the whole thing ticking.
Right, and if even one of those tiny hidden gears loses a single tooth, the entire beautiful clock just grinds to a halt. I mean, it really doesn't matter how polished the outside is at that point.
It's useless. And welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. I'm your host, and today we are prying open the casing of the global tech economy.
Glad to be here to help unpack this.
Yeah.
We are looking at those tiny, invisible gears that keep the superpowers ticking and exploring what happens when someone starts quietly buying them up.
Okay, let's unpack this because our source material for this session is an incredibly dense document. It's simply titled Eingefügter Text, which translates to inserted text.
Yeah, it's essentially a manifesto, or I guess you could call it a highly specific investment thesis. And what makes this particular text so unusual is that it wasn't written by, like, a geopolitical think tank or a government intelligence agency.
All right.
It was written by a retail investor.
Which is wild, a completely ordinary person trading stocks on their computer. Yet they are mapping out this fascinating intersection of finance, grassroots activism, and global geopolitics. Now, real quick, before we jump into the weeds here, we do need to set some ground rules for this discussion.
Absolutely.
Because this text makes some very specific, really high-stakes claims about international supply chains. Crucially, it contains very strong political viewpoints regarding the United States, the European Union, and China, specifically the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP.
Yeah, and we need to be absolutely clear to you, listening right now, we are not endorsing these views, we are not taking sides, and we are not validating the geopolitical stances outlined by this investor.
Right, we're totally neutral here.
Exactly. Our role today is strictly analytical. We are neutrally exploring the thesis exactly as it is laid out in the text, simply to understand the mechanics of the argument they are making.
We are just the guides to the material. So let's get into the mind of this investor. The entire piece starts with this declaration of intent. They are explaining their motivation for aggressively spotlighting obscure European small-cap stocks.
Yeah, it's a strategy they claim they haven't publicly stated until now. The core of the argument is that throwing a spotlight on these specific EU small-cap companies is a deliberate tactic to prevent hostile actors from taking over critical supply chain choke points.
Choke points that the American tech sector absolutely requires to function.
Right.
Yeah.
If you don't have these pieces, the whole tech ecosystem stalls out.
And the text gives us some specific examples of these tiny gears in the machine, and I gotta say, it reads like a massive alphabet soup.
Oh, it really does.
They list tickers like ALREB, which deals with quantum and MBE technology, LPK, which works with glass substrates, SI, involved in DFB lasers, and they even mention an Asian company, Nippon Chemical. I mean, to the average person, DFB lasers or MBE technology sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi novel.
Yeah, it sounds like Star Trek. But
Yeah.
let's translate some of that, because that obscurity is actually the entire point of this thesis. These companies aren't household names. They exist so deep in the supply chain that most people don't even know they exist at all.
So what are they actually making?
Well, take SIVE and their DFB lasers, for example. DFB stands for distributed feedback. These are essentially ultra-precise light sources that allow data to travel through fiber optic cables at massive speeds.
Okay, so it's internet infrastructure.
Exactly. Without them, the sheer volume of internet traffic required for modern AI would completely bottleneck. Everything would just crawl.
So they're making the literal speed of light usable for data. That's huge. What about ALRIB and that MBE technology?
Right. MBE is molecular beam epitaxy.
Wow, okay.
I know, it's a mouthful. But think of it like atomic spray painting. It's a way of building semiconductor crystals, literally one single layer of atoms at a time.
Yeah.
It is painstakingly precise, and it's absolutely necessary for creating the bleeding-edge chips used in quantum computing.
One layer of atoms at a time. That is insane.
It is. And then you have LPK with glass substrates. The industry is currently hitting a wall with traditional silicon, so glass substrates handle heat and data transfer much better for massive AI workloads.
You know, hearing you explain all this, it makes me think of the construction of a massive, state-of-the-art skyscraper, like the kind that completely defines a city skyline. As a builder, you're focused on the glass and the steel.
The big visible stuff.
Right, but the structural integrity of that entire building might depend entirely on a very specific type of specialized bolt. And that bolt is only made in one tiny, completely overlooked workshop halfway around the world.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and if someone else quietly buys that tiny workshop, well, if you control the workshop, you control the skyscraper.
I'd actually take that a step further. It's not just that the bolt is made in one workshop. It's that the builders of the skyscraper don't even know the workshop's name.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just buy the bolts from a massive middleman. So when we look at the tech in our pockets, the smartphones, the AI tools we interact with, the autonomous safety features in modern cars, we assume the big brands are building them top to bottom.
Like it's all made in one giant factory with a logo on it.
Exactly. But this investor is pointing out to you, the listener, that the entire modern tech ecosystem actually balances on these hidden pillars, these choke points that you never think about.
Which moves this from a theoretical discussion to a very concrete, real-world case study. The primary piece of evidence in this text revolves around a European company called Tech.
Yes, Vicontech is a private company. And the text notes with extreme alarm that it was recently acquired by what the author describes as Chinese CCP-affiliated companies.
The frustration in the writing here is just palpable. I mean, they write that they aren't even sure how this acquisition was legally permitted, arguing that Germany should, quote, 100% seize it back from China.
Yeah, that is a highly aggressive policy recommendation coming from someone just trading stocks on their laptop in their living room.
Right. But what's fascinating here is to understand that level of panic, we have to look at what Tech actually does. According to the text, Tech holds a quasi-monopoly, specifically a monopoly over the testing for CPO and SiP-H technologies.
Let's break those down because they're important. CPO is co-packaged optics, and SiP-H is silicon photonics.
And the text explicitly states these are needed for AI and LiDAR, right? LiDAR being the light detection and ranging tech used in autonomous vehicles.
Basically, yes. Both of those technologies are about moving data with light instead of electricity. As AI chips get faster and faster, pushing electrical signals through copper wires generates way too much heat and uses too much power.
It just melts down.
Exactly. So silicon photonics integrates tiny lasers and optical components directly onto the silicon chip. It is incredibly difficult to manufacture and even harder to test.
And the stakes become a lot clearer when you look at the client list Tech holds. I mean, the tickers listed in the text are NVDA for NVIDIA, TSM for Taiwan Semiconductor, AVGO for Broadcom, and INTC for Intel. Those are the absolute titans of computing.
The heaviest hitters in the world rely on this one quasi-monopoly in Europe to ensure their next-generation optical chips actually work.
But wait, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second regarding the logic of this threat.
Okay, go for it.
If Tech is just doing the testing, how does their acquisition actually threaten giants like NVIDIA or Intel? Like, if I take my car to a mechanic for an emissions test, the mechanic plugs a computer into the dashboard, reads the code, and tells me if it passed.
Right.
That mechanic doesn't suddenly own the proprietary blueprints to my engine. They just know it passed. So what is the exact fear here?
That's a fair question. But in the realm of advanced photonics, testing isn't just a simple pass or fail check at the end of an assembly line like an emissions test. The specific fear outlined in the text is that significant intellectual property, meaning IP transfer to China, is highly likely following this acquisition.
How does the testing process steal the IP, though? I'm still not getting that.
Because to test a silicon photonics chip, you have to know exactly how the light is supposed to bend, refract, and travel through the microscopic optical pathways on that specific chip.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have to build custom interfaces and diagnostic software that perfectly mirror the chip's architecture. You can't just test a black box at this level of physics. The testing mechanisms have to be as advanced and as intimately familiar with the design as the product itself.
Ah, I see. So the knowledge required to test the gear is literally the knowledge of how the gear is built.
Exactly. The argument implies that whoever owns the testing monopoly inherently gets a deep structural look at the proprietary designs of NVIDIA, Intel, and Broadcom. Over time, that knowledge naturally migrates. Acquiring the testing facility basically gives a foreign entity a back door into the U.S. supply chain's most closely guarded secrets.
That makes perfect sense, and honestly, it's a sobering thought, but mapping these blind spots is only half the battle. If the knowledge is slowly migrating, like you said, we have to look at how global superpowers are handling, or I guess completely mishandling, these vulnerabilities. And the text paints a very stark contrast between the European Union and the United States here.
It really is. The critique of the EU is that they have essentially operated with a massive regulatory blind spot. The text asserts that the EU has actively allowed these highly specialized upstream choke points to be bought out by geopolitical rivals, which facilitates that IP transfer.
They're just letting it happen. And while the EU is criticized for being asleep at the wheel, America is criticized for just sheer naivety. The author writes that America still might not realize a lot of these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, the idea that the most powerful economy in the world doesn't even know its optical blueprints are exposed through a German testing facility is a pretty jarring
Oh, it's
concept.
terrifying, really.
And to drive this point home, the author introduces a secondary example.
Yeah.
They bring in the ticker AXTI, which deals with N and P substrates.
NNP stands for indium phosphide.
Right. It's a compound semiconductor. It can operate at much higher frequencies and handle higher voltages than standard silicon, making it absolutely crucial for things like aerospace, high-speed telecommunications, and advanced radar.
So military applications, too. And the text points out that without independent American-owned capacity for things like NNP substrates, which they do concede is currently being built up, there will be more backdoors on American supply chains.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this entirely revolves around the concept of upstream vulnerabilities. The investor isn't just complaining about a stock losing value or a bad trade. They are outlining a strategic map of global tech blind spots.
Right.
It's like worrying about someone stealing your famous cake recipe from your bakery while completely ignoring the fact that a rival just bought the only flour mill in the tri-state area.
Oh, that's perfect, because they don't need your recipe if they control your flour. You can't bake the cake anyway.
Precisely. The consumer products, the smartphones, the AI chatbots, those are the cake. They are downstream. The substrate manufacturers, the chemical companies, the testing facilities, those are the flour mills.
Right, the raw ingredients.
The argument here is that geopolitical rivals are quietly buying up the raw material and the foundational testing layers long before it ever looks like a tech product.
So if the EU is missing this, and the US is largely oblivious to these flour mills being bought up, who is actually trying to hit the brakes here? Because this investor doesn't just complain about the problem, they propose a really unorthodox solution.
They do, and it's pretty wild.
Which brings us to the most surprising part of this entire document. The person sounding the alarm is, again, a single retail investor.
Yeah, we aren't reading a declassified intelligence briefing from the Pentagon. We are analyzing the public thesis of someone trading stocks on the open market. And their ultimate strategy for fixing this is fascinating.
They outline a very specific theory of change. They state that buying into these obscure European companies and aggressively putting a spotlight on them is the most effective thing they can do to prevent these hidden takeovers.
Just making noise.
Exactly. They literally write, with enough American ownership, enough spotlight on these companies, we would be in a worse shape with hidden CCP ownership takeovers. The grammar in the text is a little informal, obviously, but the underlying logic is clear. Shining a light prevents the darkness.
But let's look at the actual mechanism of how that works. How does a retail investor stop a state-sponsored buyout?
Yeah, how does buying a few shares do anything?
Well, it operates on two fronts. First, by publicly hyping these obscure companies on forums and social media, they aim to drive up the market cap. If a retail army buys up the float, the company becomes significantly more expensive and difficult for a foreign entity to quietly acquire.
Ah, I get it. They price the hostile actors out of the market.
Or at least make it incredibly painful financially. The second front is public noise. By generating a massive amount of chatter about these supposedly boring small-cap stocks, they force the issue into the algorithm.
So it starts trending.
Right. Financial journalists notice. Then analysts notice, and eventually the hope is that regulatory bodies, like the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States or the European equivalents, are forced to actually scrutinize these acquisitions because they are no longer flying under the radar.
So, what does this all mean? It's a bottom-up revolution. The belief that eventually policymakers will pay attention and step in to protect these choke points if the movement happens from the grassroots and pushes upward.
That's the theory.
I genuinely have to marvel at this. I mean, I have to ask you, is it actually possible for retail investors to act as a decentralized geopolitical defense system just by talking about stock tickers online?
Well, historically, we haven't seen retail investors dictate national security policy or international trade law.
Hmm.
But we have seen retail investors fundamentally break traditional financial models when they organize online. Think about recent meme stock frenzies.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
This investor is simply trying to aim that chaotic, decentralized power at supply chain defense. The underlying point is about the power of visibility. If enough people refuse to look away from the hidden gears, the people in charge of the clock are forced to acknowledge them.
It's an incredible journey we've just taken through this single piece of text. I mean, we started by looking at tiny, obscure European small caps like ALRIB and LPK, unpacking the actual science of things like MBE technology and glass substrates.
Right, and we explored the deeply concerning concept of an invisible testing monopoly with the PhyContech case study. We looked at the mechanics of how testing bleeding-edge silicon photonics inherently requires deep access to the proprietary blueprints of giants like NVIDIA and Intel.
We analyzed the critique of the EU's regulatory blind spots and America's lack of awareness regarding upstream vulnerabilities. The realization that controlling the flour mill is far more effective than stealing the cake recipe.
And we ended up looking at a grassroots financial activist trying to use market capitalization in public forums as a shield for global AI supply chains. I think the main takeaway for you, the listener, should be a complete paradigm shift in how you view the technology around you.
Absolutely. The seemingly boring layers of the tech world, the raw chemical compounds, the testing software, the lasers, these aren't just industrial footnotes, according to this thesis. They are the actual front lines of modern geopolitical strategy.
The things you never think about are the exact things global superpowers are quietly fighting over.
We spend our entire lives marveling at the face of the grandfather clock, completely oblivious to the gears inside. But if a single retail investor can map out critical, world-altering vulnerabilities in the AI supply chain just by tracking small-cap acquisitions on their laptop, it makes you wonder.
It really does.
What other invisible choke points exist in the everyday technologies you rely on, hiding right in plain sight, that the policymakers haven't even noticed yet?
A question that is definitely going to keep me up at night for sure.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking past the obvious and keep asking questions. We'll see you next time.